So begins the last topic. We're going to talk about general equilibrium. And general equilibrium is a very general notion in economics. There's many different ideas that constitute that topic. And so we're going to look at a specific one that's a relatively simple idea called exchange economies, or general equilibrium in exchange economies. The idea is that we're not really going to focus on production per se, but the idea that different entities in the economy are endowed with goods. You know, you could think of farmers that just have the land; they just produce wheat naturally, and they can change. And the farmer for wheat can exchange goods with the farmer for bananas, but there's no decision about how much to produce. In the theory of general equilibrium in the literature in economics, or the history of thought in economics, this is sort of the starting point, and then you start to add many other considerations. Um, and it's really a very deep field. It's an entire field into itself, and so this is just a word of warning that you don't walk away from this lecture thinking that that somehow economists are taking this narrow-minded of a view, but it is an insight that shows you a lot of the heavy-duty machinery in a simple context. So we've talked about this word equilibria. We thought about supply equaling demand as some notion of equilibria, and the constituent thing that determined an equilibrium was the price. So in a given market, there was some supply that came from producers. There was some demand that came from consumers, and we thought of price as a determinant which helped uh, create a level of supply and demand such that there isn't an excess on either side, so that the amount supplied is equal to the amount demanded. Um, these supply and demand curves, though, in the given market depended, of course, on the income of the consumers, the costs of the producers, the cost of inputs, right, of capital and labor. And those things themselves depended on economic decisions, potentially in other markets, right? So if you're an apple farmer, your income that you go out and spend on whatever you're consuming comes from the price of the output of apples, which is itself the equilibrium of the apple market. Likewise, there's an equilibrium in the labor market, right, where the supply is workers and the demand is jobs demanding labor. And so we could think that when we were looking at this individual market, one market at a time, we said, well, the price is going to be such that supply is going to equal demand. But this, of course, sort of neglects the fact that all the things that supply and demand curve depend on come from other markets. And so looking at a single market at a time tells us actually very little about how that price is going to look unless we know something about everything else going on in the economy, which sort of it becomes a circular issue, right? How do we determine the price for labor when we haven't determined the price for apples yet? And how do we determine the price for apples when we haven't determined the price of labor yet? And so what we're going to do now is think about general equilibrium rather than partial equilibrium. In other words, we're going to look for an equilibrium that's in all the markets simultaneously rather than each market individually. So when we look at an individual market, we take the prices and demands of other goods as given, and in general equilibrium, we're going to assume that all of these things need to be determined synchronously, which sounds like quite a tall order. It sounds like something that's going to be very complicated. And in general, it is very complicated in the sense that there's a lot of moving parts, and understanding how to make this a tractable, usable model took economists many years. And there's an interesting history to the idea of equilibrium, which we're not really going to go over in too much depth, but it was not an immediate thing. Economists did not just write down this and figure out how to analyze it very quickly. It was a difficult task, which required some careful thought. Um, so, as previously mentioned, we're going to look at the sort of simpler world of an exchange economy. There's no production, there's only consumers. So there's just different kinds of consumers, different kinds as in they have different utility functions, and they have different endowments. So if there's no production, what are they consuming? Well, they're consuming the stuff that was handed down by God, right? So each consumer in this model is given some allotment of consumption goods, In other words, a bundle in Rn. So remember that consumption takes place in Rn. Its values, each dimension of the real numbers in this case is, of the real plane, denotes the magnitude of consumption in some dimension, usually different goods, right? So the x dimension might be bell peppers, and the y dimension might be black peppercorns. And so each consumer is endowed with some amount of bell peppers and some amount of black peppercorns, and so their endowment, the amount that they start with, is just a position in that consumption space. So it's just a point in R2. So they have a bundle of endowment, right? Now, we need to be careful here in that, like, you must remember that this is shutting down production. So the idea is that you're endowed with some land which has pepper plants on it, or it's endowed with a banana tree. And this banana tree just produces, and you don't put any effort or decision making into what you're producing. Your endowment is part of your essence as a consumer. So it's almost like the consumer and the producer part are just jumbled into one thing. There's nothing you can do about it. In the textbook and in lots and lots of positions in economics, they look at production as a separate part of the economy and still think about general equilibrium. So this is not to say that you have to do it this way. This is the simplifying idea of an exchange economy, that consumers are endowed with goods and they make no decision about how much of those goods that they're endowed with. They come like that. It's a determinist, it's determined exogenously. So that comes from somewhere else. At the end of the day, in economics, that eventually we are just endowed with things, right? As a planet, we're endowed with a certain amount of resources, and people control different parts of those resources. So at some level, this is actually a good model. Of course, at the more fine-grained level, we don't consume things like palladium and uranium ore, and so you turn those things into goods that are consumable only through production means. So it lies somewhere in the realism spectrum, and we're doing it here for technical convenience. Consumers trade goods with one another, right? So you're not forced to consume. You're the bell pepper guy. You're given a bunch of bell peppers. There's the black pepper guy. He's given a bunch of black peppercorns, and you might want to switch one for the other, right? I might only have one good, but I like to consume both, right? I might have this preference for balance, like they're complement good. There's some notion of complementation between the two goods. So I'd like to trade some of my bell peppers for some black pepper, and he'd like to trade some of his black peppercorns for some bell peppers, and we're both made better off by trading with each other. So what an exchange economy allows is, well, as the name suggests, exchange. So we're able to trade goods for one another. We can barter in some sense. We can move goods around the economy by trading with one another. Now, the question that we need to think about is, what are the rules for exchange, right? What makes sense and what makes no sense? And that's going to be encoded in our definition of an equilibrium. So an equilibrium is a point at which sort of everyone is doing as good as they can, given what everyone else is doing. And I'm going to say that one more time, and because if you haven't taken a game theory class or a class in this kind of economics before, it sounds a bit foreign. Each person is optimizing, doing the best that they can, under the assumption that everyone else is going to be taking the equilibrium behavior. In other words, when the equilibrium is given by this price and these demand levels of everybody in the rest of the market, I as an individual am optimizing, and I'm doing what the equilibrium tells me to do. So I'm optimizing conditional on everyone else continuing to do what they're going to do according to the equilibrium. And it's not just me that's doing that, it's every consumer. So every person has no incentive to change their behavior. Everybody is sort of acting according to the equilibrium. The equilibrium is a set of prescriptions. It says you buy this, you buy that, you buy that at a given price, and everyone wants to follow along given the price and what they can afford. Now, what does it mean to have a price in this exchange economy? I just said I have some bell pepper, you have some black pepper, and we trade them for each other. Well, a price is just a rate of exchange. Right? We've actually thought about this all the time. We've thought about prices as units of exchange, as a rate of exchange. When we talk about the slope of the budget set being determined by the ratio of prices, what we're saying is that in a marketplace, the rate at which you can trade good X for good Y is determined by the ratio of those prices. And we're going to see that in an exchange economy, a price is nothing but that. It's just a rate at which you can exchange one good for another good. In fact, that's what a price always is. It's just that we also, in our intuitive conceptual brains, consider some value for money. We think of money as having some intrinsic use in the world, but I mean, when you really think about it, from an economic perspective, it does not. All it does is denominate how you can trade one thing for another. It also allows you to store value over time. But here, we're just going to look at a static model, a snapshot of an equilibrium. So how does this exchange work? Well, if there's a price for each good, right? So there's a price for peppercorns and there's a price for bell pepper. And then if I have bell pepper, I'm the bell pepper guy who inherited the bell pepper farm and made no decision, just got 50 million bell peppers. I go to the market and I can sell my 50 million bell peppers. And what do I sell them for? Well, I sell them for the price of bell peppers, the price being the equilibrium price. We're saying an equilibrium is a price. It's a set of prices, a price vector. And this price vector determines how much the value of my endowment, my allotment of bell peppers is. What's the value of them? So I just get I get some income by selling my bell peppers at that given price. And then with that, I can buy back whatever I'd like. I get my money from selling my bell peppers. I can buy back some bell peppers if I wanted. That's the same as if I just hadn't sold them, right? So if I sell a bell pepper for $5 and then I buy it back for $5, I could have just kept the bell pepper. So in your head, you could think I could either sell everything I have or I could sell everything I don't want and keep the stuff that I want. But either way, I sell everything and turn it into income. Effectively, I sell everything and turn it into income. And then I buy back what I want. I could buy back what I just sold. I could buy back the other thing too. I could buy back some peppercorns, right? And what do we need from this? Well, each consumer goes to the market, they sell their endowment. Their income from selling the endowment depends on this equilibrium price vector. Now they can buy back other stuff in the economy. And what do they want to buy back? They want to buy back, well, their Walrasian demands, given this price vector and given the income that they just received from selling their goods. And we need that the prices are such that the total demand is equal to the total supply. Again, an equilibrium is a price which requires that demand is equal to supply, right? So it's the same as the partial equilibrium. The only difference is now the income of the consumer is determined by some endowment rather than by some just notion of price, notion of income. And two, we're looking at the price in every market at the same time. So the following, what we're going to ask for the rest of the course in the next couple of lectures are: one, when does such an equilibrium exist? Two, is an equilibrium desirable or efficient? Are there properties? Can we analyze the welfare of individuals in these given equilibria? And three, how does the initial allocations affect the resulting equilibrium? So what is the correspondence between the stuff that we're endowed with and our position after we've made exchanges? It's worth noting that I described this economy as I'm exchanging goods between I'm the bell pepper guy and I'm exchanging for black peppercorns. And then I described it differently with prices as I sell everything to the market and then I buy back the amount of black bell peppers and the amount of black peppercorns I want. And it's worth noting that as long as demand equals supply, these two things are actually equivalent in the sense that I could trade him some peppercorns. I could trade him some bell peppers for peppercorns. I keep some bell peppers. I have 3 bell peppers now. I lost my 47,000 of them. I have my 3 bell peppers. I want 1. I trade 2 away, and I get some peppercorns for that, right? And he keeps most of his peppercorns, and he trades them to me for those 2 bell peppers, right? And so we've exchanged. Now, there's a price at which that exchange makes sense, and the price is such that the ratio of the prices is such that the amount of bell peppers I gave him is equal to, in price, the amount of peppercorns he gave me. And so prices are just mechanisms to enable exchange. And that is the key idea here. Prices are just mechanisms to enable exchange at a particular rate. And I want to hammer this home, that is the same way we've been thinking about price the whole time. Now we've said prices are set externally. Now prices are set internally by the relative values of these things in this economy. But nonetheless, it is just given by a slope, right? It's a rate of exchange between the two different goods. So I'm going to stop here for now, and we'll make a more rigorous definition of this in the next lecture. A mathematical definition.